Hi there. Welcome to How to Optimize Azure for Disaster Recovery session at the MVPDays virtual conference. One of the goals of this session is to do an holistic approach and looking how we can leverage Azure for my disaster recovery. First of all, I want to apologize in advance for my accent. I'm from Portugal. I'm a Canadian MVP. I work for AMTRA Solutions as a principal solution architect. I'm also a P seller, a Microsoft P seller. I'm also a Azure advisor. You can find me on my blog on azurecenter.com or follow me at my Twitter handle. But the topic of today is disaster recovery. Why disaster recovery is so important? I cannot emphasize enough that this is one of the things that causes a lot of disasters or a lot of outages. For example, here in Calgary, we had the last year some events that make some organizations some damage. In some cases, to be offline. So all the companies relies on IT in such a way. So IT systems are totally needed for this world that we live in now. So a lot of implementing of disaster recovery across organizations can be a nightmare, and usually they are always left behind. So a lot of organizations they don't think disaster recovery only after they implement their systems or if they have any kind of disaster in between. So if we look around the world, we can see that how everyone is susceptible to discovery. Uh, every company needs to think this about because of the last nature events. So it's floods, it's fires, it's everything that is happening. And some of the people say that we still are on this transition of the world and anything happens. But it's not only disaster. What happened on the service outages? So sometimes you have a service outage for an hour, for two, that can leverage to some kind of damage on a long-terming brand. So for example, imagine how critical on this time of the year that Amazon will be without the website working. So it's not only the problem of the monetary part of it, it's the brand that they are looking for to it. So to do this, what I construct on this session is four topics. How can we replicate our applications to Azure? Provide disaster recovery with Azure, enable the clients to connect to their services, and how I can protect data in Azure. So talking about disaster recovery, this is the challenge that I see in every single day. So one of them is the costs. We have these huge data centers. That's a lot of investment. Is the application that we need to run. Everything that we concentrate on that data center, it's okay, it's working. We put a lot of effort. We put a lot of costs regarding resources to just maintain the data center. And not to talk about the hardware, we need to refresh that data center all the time. So that what it leaves us is to the second point, that is the complexity. Because when we introduce the theme of disaster recovery, now we have to introduce multiple data centers. So now on one data center I have this perfect configuration of networking. So now I have more than one data center that I need to replicate to. So now I need to extend my network. How will the connection between the two data centers needs to happen? I need to have at least two connections for that happen. What technology of replication do I need? Do I need replication on low level? Do I need replication on hypervisor? Do I need an replication on OS level? And what kind of management of software? So all of these complexities I need to take care regarding that as a challenge for implementing disaster recovery. The last one is the reliability. So the reliability is so important because it's one of the major things that we need to do it. It's how I can recovery, how I can provide a disaster recovery as a service. So in this case, how can Microsoft Azure help us to accelerate this strategy to going to Azure? One of them is to reduce costs. Because if you are thinking and if you are doing this and you have two data centers, one data center you are not using but you are still paying. On Azure, because it's a public cloud, you only use or only pay what you use. So in this case, if you implement, for example, Azure Site Recovery, you can replicate your primary data center through Azure, and you are only paying that service and a small amount of storage. When you don't need to pay for all the compute, you don't need to pay for all of that. Reduce the complexity because now you don't need to set up any other network. You don't need to set up anything regarding your secondary data center. It's Azure being there waiting for the disaster to occur, so then you can move those workloads from on-prem to the cloud. And then you increase the reliability. Why? Because Azure is everywhere. You have data centers in Canada, in US, in Europe, in Australia, in Brazil, wherever you want, you have data centers. So you have an extension globally to just do your disaster recovery. So how disaster recovery achieve on-prem? So usually you have this primary application or we have this primary location. Those locations you need to meet those recovery point objects and recovery time objectives. So for this, you have on a primary, you have the storage as your underlying, your physical, and then you have your hypervisor, your operating system, and your app. So to be able to do this on-prem, you need to replicate that to the secondary. In some kind of way, you need some kind of technology that it does the storage replication from one side to the other. So you need to manage this. Even on hypervisor, doesn't matter if you have Hyper-V or VMware, you need to replicate on a hypervisor level from one side to another. On OS, do you have an agent on that OS that replicates everything from one side, the primary side, to the other one? And in some cases, some applications are ready for doing this disaster recovery. Other ones, they aren't. So you need to process that as well. And of course, you need to have the users, when that disaster occurs, to log in to the secondary one. So how we will address all of those changes. So how, in this case, a disaster recovery to Azure will change that process that you already have implemented. So it's exactly the same process, but of course with the benefits that you have on Azure. So from the storage to storage. So in this case, instead of having a second data center, you are replicating your storage to Azure. So your that block of storage to Azure on the hypervisor level as well. So it doesn't matter if you have Hyper-V or VMware, you are replicating on a hypervisor level to the Azure as well. On the OS, you have the agent on the OS that replicates from the OS level to the other side, to the cloud, and an application as well. So for example, you have on the storage side, you have Store Simple and Azure File Sync that enables you to just replicate your storage. Azure Site Recovery is responsible for replicating your hypervisor in the OS from on-prem to the cloud. And for example, services like SQL Always On, you can have an application running on-prem and replicating to the cloud. In this case, you are covered. But what happens in this case if you need to migrate to Azure? Do all the service needs to migrate to Azure? So should the service just move to the cloud because the cloud is where you can have all of this disaster recovery? So service like Office, for example, should you consider to migrate Office up front? Because is Exchange, SharePoint, and Skype is critical, because if you have a disaster, how you can send an email, how you can access the information that you need to do, where is all your procedures in case of disaster. So if anything happens on on-prem and you don't have access to that information, probably should consider these services to just move upfront to the cloud. So this could be a critical during any DR solution or any DR failover to facilitate the communications between all the parties. A better option is to move, for example, from a SaaS-based solution to in this to the cloud, like example Office 365. Also could be something approach on other services. And for that, I want to share with you one example of a Canadian company that before implementing the disaster recovery, all of these services that were critical, they moved to the cloud. So if you look, for example, at Capstone Mining Corp, it's a Canadian mining company. They moved to Office 365 before they implemented the disaster recovery solution. So in this case, they were able to save over $6 million in 3 years to just moving these first services to the cloud. So this is a good approach before starting even doing the disaster recovery implementation. Okay, now that we see some example of being proactive instead of disaster recovery, how we can do this. So how Azure File Service works in this case. So Azure File Sync, what you're having is you have a service that you set up on Azure, that you set up that sync from the file. It does a block moving to the cloud. So you have your initial sync, your initial replication from your server on-prem to the cloud. Then through the Azure Backup Vault, you are backing up those services, those files that you needed, and anything happens to that server at the first, you still have access to the files because they are on Azure. It's just a matter of pointing. In the meanwhile, okay, if anything happens to the files, you are still accessing those files, you can spawn another server and then you can usually do the sync back to the server, and now that server is available on-prem again, so you don't lose any information. So you can centralize the service, manage through the cloud service, and reduce the complexity, because right now everything you have on-prem just for performance, but for compatibility and for having the service available, it's everything it's been synced with the cloud. Another solution is with Hyper-V Replica to Azure. So besides you have Hyper-V Replica from one site to another is exactly the same. So you have a VM, you have Azure in this case, so you can enable Azure to replicate from your target Hyper-V VMs using ASR. So how it works? So a VM writes on the disk. So after writes on the disks, it will write on Hyper-V replica log. So that log is sent to the cloud, to Azure. Okay, it will commit into a VHD on Azure, and you are not using any compute. This is only using the ASR service and of course the storage. So if you need to test this, if you need to do any kind of disaster recovery, so far at this present moment you are not paying anything else besides the service of Azure Site Recovery and the storage. So in this case, if you want to test, and this is the truly test of disaster recovery, you are, when you starting that test is when you starting to pay. In this case, for the compute that is the most expensive part of running on Azure. So after you test this, you can discommission all of these services and all of these servers, and then you stop paying. And now you can truly test your production environment. For example, you have SAP that is running on Hyper-V on-prem. You want to test the new functionality of the new release of SAP. How you can do that with the production data. So using Azure Site Recovery, you can test a failover. It spin up the entire new environment on Azure. You starting from that moment, you're starting to be built for that compute power. After you're doing all the tests, you just stop the tests and automatic deletes everything for you. Exactly the same thing on OS level. So this that I was talking about is regarding Hyper-V. Even if you don't have Hyper-V, I know you could be a sad person that doesn't know Hyper-V yet. You are using VMware. So VMs on VMware or even physical hardware, what you can do is a guest-based replication solution. How we can achieve this? To the disk driver writes that our operating system does to the disk is sent to Azure via what's called a process server. So how is this work? So by implementing this solution, you are implementing the mobility service. This is the agent that stays between the file system and the disk driver. What you need to do is on-prem. This is everything on-prem. You need to set up a process server. So how is that work? You have the Azure Site Recovery. So the file system writes on disk. So the mobility server captures that, sends to process server. As soon as possible, the process server sends to Azure Site Recovery to a VHD. So at this present moment, you are securing everything that your file system is sending to the disk. So the mobility server is capturing that and sending to a VHD. When you need to do this, you can migrate all of that workload to Azure using Azure Site Recovery. This is the way that you can migrate from VMware or even for physical to the Hyper-V that is running on Azure Site Recovery on Azure. On an application level replication, for example. So in this case, you have your application that is doing from one server to another. You can set up, for example, Azure Availability Group with Azure. So you need to set up another server on Azure that belongs to that availability group, and then you can run an instance from there. Although there are some requirements, you need connectivity. So if you don't have a site-to-site VPN, ExpressRoute is one of the other ways that you do it. Although these are compute charged because the third node it's running on Azure and needs to be running 100% of the time. So it could be something that you can leverage. Service requiring the highest RPO and RTO are good candidates for this tier 1 SQL Server or domain controllers, for example. Other less critical applications may use a cheaper solution, for example, as ASR. This is for application level replication. But in all of those questions that I see on my customers, not all the components needs to be replicated. Why? Azure, in this case, you can create hundreds of these service instances in minutes, literal in minutes. So basically, for example, what we call stateless service, web front ends that you don't have too much change, you can replicate those. You can have a machine that you're doing a backup and easily you can have this service up and running in a matter of minutes. You can even use VM scale sets to just doing that. You remove the need for a license and compute charges. So why you need in this case to pay, for example, for Azure Site Recovery service when this service doesn't need or doesn't change much? Because remember, Azure Site Recovery, you paying for that service as well. So for example, you have a gold image that you have all the configuration inside. You have the VM scale set already configured on that gold image. So in a matter of minutes, regarding that skill set, you can deploy several of other workloads. And the good thing about this is are scalable. So if you need to scale to way more, you can even scale if it's needed. Okay. Another thing about disaster recovery is regarding the orchestration. So for each workload, there are dependencies. So if you have a web server and a database, how I can orchestrate those. So for those examples, a failover process should be a single click action. You should create groups for each one of those individuals or each one of those applications that they are priorities. You need to set up those priorities. Azure Site Recovery provides that plan, but you need in this case some kind of automation. So for example, if a disaster recovery occurs, you have the failover VM group 1 that you can run an automation runbook on Azure to do automatically this. This is the tier 1 of criticality. Then on the VM group 2, you can have, for example, the SQL's always on. So you still have on-prem, SQL's always on, you send that on a single click action, you can send the VM, or in this case the group 2. And on the last one that they are not as important or not as critical but still are critical, you can do it the manual pull lever in this case. So on the press of another button, in this case you are failover the group 3. So with this you can orchestrate the way that you need all of this configuration. So regarding the connectivity for these services, what you need to implement is, if you have service on the public endpoints, it is you need to move to Azure. So use Traffic Manager, for example, to use that. So how can Traffic Manager help you? So imagine that you have an on-premise service and an Azure service. With Traffic Manager, you can reroute that traffic. If the on-prem service is unavailable, it will reroute to the Azure services. From the client access perspective, so it doesn't matter if you are if you have a failover, that's where it's critical. How your internal users will access those systems. So you can set up a VDI solution that is on standby using RDSH or Citrix is a possibility solution for you set up this on Azure. Another thing is the connectivity from other offices. Do you need to set up a site-to-site VPN with Azure? In this case, I see a lot of companies starting to move their VPN from on-prem to centralize on Azure, because if anything happens on disaster recovery, they already have that connectivity. So it's just a matter of doing the failover and everything else is running on Azure. And then of course that you have your applications, and from wherever you set up, you can access those applications while you are disaster recovery, while you have a disaster on your data center. Another way that you can do it is on Azure Service Protection. So remember, it's not just moving to a cloud IaaS or PaaS that you have DR by default. And this is a misconception that I see in a lot of clients that I'm talking about regarding disaster recovery. So you still need to consider full resilience of the service. It's not because it's Azure that you are fully covered. So you need to consider services. For example, again, Traffic Manager with the scale as required. So for example, you have storage on one region. What's happened if you lost the communication with that region? What happens if that region becomes unavailable? You need to set up those services to replicate to the second region, so then you can be totally, in this case, covered by any kind of problem. Another way that you can achieve this is using the Azure Region Resiliency. So with Azure, with the availability zones, that basically sets a region with multiple data centers, that each data center have a latency lower than 5 milliseconds, you can enable workloads to distribute across the region. So when you deploy one of those virtual machines, for example, you are not only concentrating on one data center. If data center have any problems, for example, as a power problem, you have still the other zones, or still the other data centers that can provide you with that. The good thing about the availability zones is you don't need any change on the virtual network, because when you set up a virtual network on that region, it will grow across the three data centers using the virtualization network, or network virtualization in this case. So this is how you can set up your availability zone. If you want only regional, if you want within one data center, two or three data centers. Azure Site Recovery. This is the main reason that we're talking right now. Is one of my favorite features of Azure. With Azure Site Recovery, you can do the disaster recovery from Azure to Azure. So this is still in preview right now, but basically you can do from one region to another. You can do even across the globe. So you can do from US to Australia on the other side of the globe. So the same failover experience that you know from on-prem to Azure, you now have from Azure to Azure. You can set up this test disaster recovery in 3 steps. This is one of the ways that even if your company wants to move to a cheaper data center, for example, or that doesn't have any more capacity and you want to move to a different region, this is the way that you can do it. It's quick to ensure your application's compliance. So now let's move to a demo so now I can show you Azure Site Recovery. So now we are here at the Azure portal. I'm on Recovery Service Vault, and as you can see, I don't have any Recovery Service Vault created. So what I'm going to demoing is how to create one Recovery Service Vault, and then enable the replication between them. So for that, I just click Recovery Service Vault. I just create a name. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the West US location that I want. West US 2. I already have a resource group there. What is my resource group? Here it is, my resource group, and basically I'm creating my recovery service vault. So what I'm doing right now is just basically create all the things that I need to create regarding the recovery service vault. You can create as many recovery service vault as you want in this case. So the recovery service vault is created. So now if I hit refresh, I can see my recovery service vault. The first thing that I need to do is configure my infrastructure. So under getting started, I click site recovery. I will prepare my infrastructure right now. I will set up the goal. So Azure preview, I have other options if I want where my machines are located, on-prem on Azure. So in this case, I want to Azure and I want to replicate to Azure. So I click OK. I click OK twice. Now my infrastructure is done. So now I'm replicating my applications. So now I want from Azure, I want my source location. So I did create my recovery service vault on East US. In this case, my source is West US is where I have my VMs. This is the resource groups where I have my VMs. I click OK. Now I will see all my VMs. So I will select the DC, the front end, and the SQL at the same time, 3, as you can see it over here. Now what it will ask me to do it is ask me to create all of those configuring settings. So if I want to change my target resource group, or if I want to change any of those availability sets, for example, I can come over here, customize, and I can say that my availability set for this case it's this, but this front-end server I don't want availability set. Okay, so it says me that it cannot set application, so it's part of availability set, so I need to do as availability set because it's already part on availability set. So after that I create the target resources. This is where I do my replication. So after the validation went through, I click enable replication, and now I'm enabled the 3 VMs. So if I click over here, I will see that my jobs will start showing on here and is on progress, and I can see that it's already creating the site. It already create the policy, is creating the site. Then it will start to synchronize all of the applications. So this take a few seconds to create, and after that starts to replicate all my VMs from West US to East US. So right now is already create the site. It creates the protection container, and now it's creating a site for the other VM. So this is creating the site, sorry, on West US. So now it's creating the site on East US. So at this present moment, he already starting to create the network. He started to create the replication policies, already created a network, and he's creating another network on West US. In this case, for this network over here, when if I want to test this, this is the network that he will be using for totally isolated from the other network that I already have set up on these environments. So at this moment already create the replication policies and all the networks required, and now is starting to protect the VMs. So the front end server, the domain controller, and the SQL is starting to see those. So if I come to my replication vault, if I want to see those replication items, now I can see the replication items are here, and they are starting to enable the protection. So I can click on one of these and starting to see some of those properties, the compute and power in this case that it needs to configure. I'm not using any computing power right now. The machine is in progress, so I cannot change any of those settings, but I can see that they are protecting everything. So now that you see how it's simple to set up Azure Site Recovery from a region to another region, is almost the same work or amount of work that you need to do it if you want to do it from on-prem to in the cloud. So to continuing our session is everything is good, but don't forget about Azure Backup. Azure Backup is one of my favorite features as well. You can set up backup on a VM in 3 steps, and I will show you on my last demo. You can customize your intention to be set on daily, weekly, monthly, or year. And the good thing about this is the retention period. It's up to 99 years, although it's not yet tested, as you can imagine, because you don't have Azure for 99 years. But you can have up to 9,999 recovery points. So now it's time for the second and last demo. So we are back to Azure portal. on a recovery service vault. So I have another recovery service vault, in this case just to demoing the Azure backup. So it's exactly on the same way as you can see Azure backup and site recovery. In this case I will set up the Azure backup. So this is where you can use the when you have your workloads running, you can have on-prem on Azure. So Azure backup does backup from on-premise as well. And what you want to backup, if it's a virtual machine, in this case of Azure, if I want on-prem, I will have to I have more options to select. In this case, what I want is from Azure to a virtual machine. I will choose the default policy. In this case, you can create another policy for the backup. I will use the default policy, and then I will see my VMs that I want to backup. I just select my VMs, I validate, and I enable the backup. It's that simple. So right now the deployment is on progress and is starting to do the backup on all of my on the VMs that I did selected. So here it is. It's already creating all of that, and if I see on my backup, I will see that I will have backup items that I will have in a few moments. I will have two VMs over here when this deployment is over. As you can see, I already have two VMs backup, and now they passed the backup pre-check, and last backup is doing the initial backup that is pending. So after the initial backup, what it does is does incremental backups every single time and creates a recovery policy or the recovery points regarding my recovery policy. So that concludes the last demo of Azure Backup. And with this, I conclude my session today. So thank you very much. Muito obrigado. If you have any questions, just use the hashtag MVP Hour. We will be available even after this session to respond to all your questions. Thank you and have a great day.